The music had not yet started when Clayton Sheridan crossed the entire length of the Millhaven social hall to reach her. Hazel Brooks saw him coming and her breath stopped completely, because men like Clayton Sheridan did not walk toward women like her. Not at socials, not anywhere, not ever. He moved through the crowd of perfumed women in their ribbon-trimmed dresses and men in their Sunday finest with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided something the rest of the room had not yet figured out. His eyes did not waver. They stayed on her, and her alone, and Hazel felt the weight of every gaze in the room shift and settle on the spectacle of it. She pressed her back against the pine plank wall and told herself to look away, to find something fascinating in the floorboards or the hanging lanterns or the bowl of dried apple punch on the table to her left. She could not. She stood there in her plain brown calico dress with the hem she had let down twice and still was not quite long enough, her dark hair pinned up in the practical, graceless way she had always done it because there was nobody to show her anything different, and she watched Clayton Sheridan walk straight to her like she was the only landmark in a flat and featureless plain. He stopped 2 feet away. The fiddle player was still tuning his strings. The caller was still rolling up his sleeves. The whole hall smelled of pine resin and nervous sweat and the faint sweetness of someone's apple cake cooling on the side table. Clayton Sheridan held out his hand. "Miss Brooks," he said, "would you do me the honor?" The silence that followed was enormous. It filled every corner of the room the way floodwater fills a cellar, rising fast and cold and absolute. Hazel heard someone, she thought it was Cecily Hartwell, who wore yellow like she had invented it, draw a sharp breath. She heard a low murmur pass through the gathered women near the punch bowl. She heard the fiddle stop its tuning mid-note. She looked at Clayton's outstretched hand. She looked up at his face. She had seen that face a dozen times across the span of Millhaven's 3 short years as a town, had catalogued it the way a woman catalogues things she knows she will never have. Square jaw, steady gray eyes the color of a winter creek, a scar along his left temple that she had always wondered about and never dared to ask. "The music hasn't started," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I know," he said. He did not lower his hand. And in that precise moment, Hazel Brooks understood that something had just cracked open in her life, some sealed door she had believed permanently shut, and she had no idea whether what was on the other side of it was rescue or ruin. She had not always lived in Millhaven, Kansas. She had not always been the woman pressed against walls at socials watching other people dance. There had been a time before, and the before was the thing that had shaped the after into something small and careful, and almost entirely without hope. Hazel had come to Millhaven in the spring of 1878, 3 years after the town itself had been scratched into the Kansas prairie by a collection of optimistic settlers. A land speculator named Gerald Tate, who had long since departed for more profitable ventures, and a handful of stubborn homesteaders who had looked at the flat, unending grass and decided it was enough. She had arrived on the twice-weekly stage from Dodge City carrying 1 trunk, a cloth sewing bag, and a letter of employment from a woman named Margaret Sutter who ran the only dry goods store in town and needed someone to help with the accounts. She was 24 years old. She was not beautiful, and she had known it long enough that the knowing no longer carried much pain. She had her mother's square face and her father's unremarkable coloring, a combination that produced nothing striking on either front. Her eyes were a decent enough brown, and her hands were capable and steady, and those were the things she had decided to be proud of because pride had to attach itself to something or it shriveled and died. What she had not carried into Millhaven, what she had left behind in the town of Hatcher's Creek, Missouri, along with her family's failed homestead and the remnants of a life that had been stripped apart by drought and debt, and her father's long dying, was any expectation of being seen. She had learned early and thoroughly that plain women were furniture in other people's stories. They were useful, often. They were reliable, usually. They were not the women men crossed rooms for. And then Clayton Sheridan crossed a room for her. Let us go back 7 months before the social, to the August afternoon when Hazel Brooks first truly noticed Clayton Sheridan, because noticing is where all love stories begin, even when the people inside them do not yet know they are inside a love story at all. It was the kind of August day that Kansas produces with almost insulting regularity. The sky, a bleached pale blue, the heat pressing down on everything with the flat relentlessness of a hand on the back of a neck. Hazel was closing up Sutter's dry goods at 5:30, pulling the front shutters across the window display of bolts of fabric and tins of baking powder, and the new shipment of Arbicle's coffee that Margaret Sutter had been so proud of ordering, when she heard shouting from the direction of the livery stable. Shouting in Millhaven was not unusual. The town had 3 saloons for a population of perhaps 400, which was at least 2 saloons too many, and disagreements tended to resolve themselves loudly if not always quickly. But this shouting had a different quality to it. It had the high-pitched edge of real fear underneath, and Hazel, who had listened carefully to sounds all her life, because she had learned that survival depended on hearing what was coming before it arrived, stepped around the shutter and looked. Tom Briggs had a boy, couldn't have been more than 10 years old, the Calloway child, young Pete Calloway, who ran errands for the telegraph office, backed up against the side wall of the livery, with a grip on the boy's collar that had lifted him nearly off his feet. Tom Briggs was a drover, passing through as so many drovers did, and he was large in the way of men who have spent years moving cattle, and he was drunk, and he was shouting something about a missing coin purse into the terrified face of a child who clearly had nothing to do with any missing coin purse. Hazel was already moving toward them, not because she was brave in any remarkable way, but because the shouting had hit the specific frequency of a child in danger, and her feet had decided before her mind could deliberate. She had gotten perhaps 15 steps when someone moved past her, faster and quieter than she would have thought possible for a man of his size. She did not know his name yet. She knew his face from across the general store counter, had sold him rope and lamp oil, and once a particularly fine pair of leather gloves that he had studied with genuine care before purchasing. She knew he was a rancher of some kind, that he had claimed land 5 miles east of town, that he came in perhaps twice a month for supplies. She did not know anything else. She watched him reach Tom Briggs in 4 long strides and do something she had not expected. He did not grab the man, did not shout, did not escalate the confrontation in the way men so often did when they wanted to assert their own rightness over another man's wrongness. He stepped close and he spoke. His voice was low enough that Hazel could not hear the words from where she stood, but whatever he said, Tom Briggs turned and looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has just realized the situation has become considerably more complicated than they thought. He set the Calloway boy down. Pete scrambled sideways and ran, and Hazel let out the breath she had been holding in a long, slow exhale. The 2 men faced each other for a moment longer. Then Tom Briggs swore loudly and walked away in the direction of the nearest saloon, and the stranger turned, and his eyes found Hazel standing 10 feet away with her hand still raised from where she had been about to do something, though she was not entirely sure what. He walked over to her. "Were you about to go in?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "With what?" She looked at her raised hand. She was still holding the shutter hook, a long iron implement for fastening the wooden shutters closed. It was a perfectly reasonable tool for its intended purpose, and would have made an unreasonable but not ineffective weapon. "I hadn't entirely decided," she admitted. Something shifted in his expression. It was not quite a smile. It was more like the moment before a smile, the thing that happens in a person's eyes when they are genuinely amused but have not yet committed to showing it. "Clayton Sheridan," he said, and offered his hand. "Hazel Brooks," she said, and shook it. That was the beginning, though she would not recognize it as such for some time. Recognition, in her experience, required repeated evidence before it would agree to be believed. The evidence came in pieces over the following months. Clayton Sheridan came into Sutter's dry goods more frequently than twice a month. He came in for supplies, yes, but he also came in to talk first to Margaret Sutter, who was 60 years old and built like a wagon axle and fond of anyone who would sit still long enough for a conversation. And then, gradually, to Hazel. He asked her things. Not the surface-level questions that people asked each other in small western towns, where everyone knew already that you had come from Missouri and worked in the dry goods and lived in the 2 rooms above the barber shop that were available for rent. He asked her what she thought. He asked if she had read the newspapers that came in on the stage and what her opinion was of the debates happening in the Topeka legislature over land rights. He asked her once, on a slow Tuesday afternoon when the rain had kept most of the town indoors and Margaret had gone upstairs to rest her knees, whether she thought a person could be fundamentally changed by a place or whether they always remained what they had started out as. That question surprised her enough that she forgot, for a moment, to be careful. I think a place can scrape away the parts of you that were never truly yours to begin with, she said. The parts you inherited or borrowed or wore because it seemed expected. And then you find out what's underneath. Whether that's a change or a discovery, I couldn't say. He was quiet for a moment, turning a spool of thread over in his hands without looking at it. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years, he said. She wanted to ask him what had happened 3 years ago. She did not ask. She filed it away with the other things she had noticed and could not quite account for. The way he sat with his back to walls in the store, scanning the room when anyone new came in. The fact that he always paid in coin, never ran a tab. The single time in early September, when she had been taking inventory in the back storage room and overheard him ask Margaret, with a casualness that was almost convincing, whether anyone had come through town asking after a man matching his description. Margaret had said no, and Clayton had said thank you, and Hazel had stood very still behind a stack of flour sacks and understood that there was a dark past threaded through Clayton Sheridan's careful present, a secret or a danger or possibly both, and that she was already too curious about him to pretend otherwise. The social was announced on the first Friday of November, 1878. A poster went up on the board outside the post office, printed on the small hand press that Millhaven's newspaper, the Weekly Register, used for such announcements. Annual Millhaven Social and Dance, the poster read, Saturday, November the 9th, Millhaven Community Hall, doors open at 7, music by the Dennison Brothers and accompaniment, all residents welcome, refreshments provided. Margaret Sutter told Hazel she ought to go. I always go, Hazel said, because she did. She went every year, had gone for 3 years running, and every year she stood near the punch bowl or helped refill the refreshment table or talked to the older women who were also not dancing. And she came home at 10 o'clock and told herself it did not matter and went to sleep. It was not quite true that it did not matter, but it was true enough to be useful. This year is different, Margaret said, in the knowing tone she used when she was about to say something that Hazel would not be able to argue with. Why? Margaret looked at her over the rims of her spectacles with an expression that contained an entire conversation Hazel was not prepared to have. Wear something nice, Margaret said. The blue one. The blue dress was a dress Hazel had made herself the previous winter from a bolt of fine cotton that a woman passing through had sold cheaply, because it was the wrong shade of blue for what she had intended. It was a plain dress, simpler by far than what most women in Millhaven would wear to a social, but the fabric was good and the cut was right for Hazel's particular shape, and she had put real care into the stitching. She had never worn it anywhere because the color was a true blue, not a faded dusty blue or a prairie-muted blue, and she had always felt that wearing it to a social would constitute a kind of statement she was not entitled to make. She wore it to the social. She had spent 20 minutes on her hair, which was more time than usual, and had ended up with something only marginally more elaborate than her everyday arrangement but still more careful. And she had looked at herself in the small mirror above the wash basin in her 2 rooms above the barber shop, and thought that she looked like what she was, a plain woman in a good blue dress, making an effort. She had arrived at the social at 7:15, with the room already crowded and the Dennison brothers still setting up on the small raised platform at the far end of the hall. The lanterns were lit, casting everything in warm amber. Someone had brought bundles of dried prairie grass and autumn leaves for decoration, and they stood in tin pails along the walls, making the hall feel almost festive. The smell of coffee and baked goods competed with wood smoke from the stove in the corner that was doing its best against the November cold. She had found her familiar position near the wall, not quite at the punch bowl this year but close enough to it, and she had watched the room fill with people she recognized, and some she did not. Cecily Hartwell had arrived in her yellow dress with her sister on one arm and the express intention, visible from across the room, of being the most admired woman present. The Dennison brothers tested their instruments. The caller stretched his arms over his head and reviewed what appeared to be handwritten notes. Hazel had been watching the door in the way she always watched doors, the habitual awareness of exits and entrances that she had developed in the years of her father's long, terrible illness, when there had always been something to brace for, when she saw Clayton Sheridan come in. He was wearing his good coat, a dark wool coat she had seen him purchase from Margaret in September, and his hat was in his hand, and he stood in the doorway for a moment scanning the room in the way she had learned to recognize as automatic for him, checking, assessing, settling. Then his gaze moved across the crowded hall and found her. He had looked at her the way a compass needle finds north. And then he had walked across the room and held out his hand before the music started and asked her to dance. "I know," he had said when she told him the music hadn't started. He had not lowered his hand. She took it. There was a sound from the room around them, a collective exhale of astonishment or judgment or possibly both, and then the fiddle launched itself into the opening notes of a reel, and the caller hollered out his first set of instructions, and the social swallowed the moment whole, the way socials always do, transforming the private into the public and the startling into the ordinary within the space of a single measure of music. But none of that happened to Clayton and Hazel because they were already moving. He danced the way she would have expected from a man like him, not showily, but well. He had the kind of timing that comes from practice rather than performance, a steadiness that she could follow without thinking too hard about the steps, and she found herself relaxing into it in a way she had not relaxed in a very long time, not since before Missouri. Maybe not ever, in the particular way that means you have allowed someone else to lead and trusted that they will not lead you somewhere terrible. "You look surprised," he said, during a turn in the reel where they were briefly close. "I am," she said. "At me asking or at the dancing?" "Both," she said, "primarily the asking." He turned her correctly through the next figure before answering. "I've been working up to it for 3 months," he said. It felt like the right occasion to stop working and start doing. The reel ended. The Dennison brothers paused for approximately 4 seconds and launched into a waltz, which was a bolder choice for a community social in Kansas in 1878, and Hazel was still processing what Clayton had said about 3 months when he adjusted his hold and stayed. 3 months, she said. "Since August," he said. "Since the shutter hook," she laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and the unexpectedness of it made it genuine, a real laugh that she could feel all the way through her chest. "That was not impressive," she said. "I thought it was impressive," he said. "You were going to wade into that situation with an iron hook and no plan and something like complete moral certainty. I found that very impressive." "I had a plan," she said. "It was just unformed." "That's the best kind," he said. They danced the waltz to its end. Hazel was aware of the room in the way that you are aware of a fire when you are not quite close enough to be burned by it. The heat, the presence, the knowledge that it is watching. She knew what people were seeing. She knew what they were saying to each other behind their hands. She was not beautiful, and Clayton Sheridan was the most well-regarded unmarried man in the county, and the story they were making up with their eyes was not a flattering one. She pulled back slightly when the waltz ended and he kept hold of her hand. "They're talking," she said. "Not a complaint, an observation." "I expect so," he said. "Doesn't that bother you?" He considered the question with the seriousness she had come to recognize as characteristic of him. The way he actually thought about things before answering instead of reaching for the first comfortable response. "Not in the way you mean," he said. "There are things I'm genuinely afraid of. What people say at a social is not one of them." She wanted to ask him what he was genuinely afraid of. The question pressed against the inside of her teeth, and she held it back because the moment was fragile, the way new things are fragile, and she did not want to break it with the weight of a question he was not ready for. What she did not know, standing in the Millhaven social hall with her hand in Clayton Sheridan's hand, while the Dennison brothers caught their breath, and the room murmured around them, was that the thing he was genuinely afraid of was already moving toward Millhaven at approximately the pace of a man on a good horse with a purpose. His name was Denton Voss, and he was the reason Clayton Sheridan watched doors. The story of Denton Voss and Clayton Sheridan reached back 5 years, to a stretch of Texas rangeland that existed in the legal and moral borderland that characterized much of the territory in the years following the war. Clayton had been 27 then, working for a cattle operation called the Rafter C, spread outside of a town called Marlin, and Denton Voss had been the operations foreman. The arrangement that Denton Voss ran at the Rafter C was not entirely legal. Clayton had understood this in a general way when he took the job, because in 1873 in Central Texas, a man who needed work asked fewer questions than he might have preferred. He had understood it more specifically over the following 6 months as he discovered the particular nature of the arrangement. Denton Voss was not only running the Rafter C's legitimate cattle business. He was also running cattle from the neighboring spreads, rebranding them with a speed and thoroughness that made the operation difficult to prove and easy to profit from. Clayton had made a decision. It was not a decision he had arrived at easily, because the life of a man who informs on his employer to the county sheriff is not a comfortable life, and he had known that going in. But there had been a family named Prout on the spread adjacent to the Rafter C, a man and his wife and 2 young daughters, and the Rafter C operation was systematically taking everything they had worked to build, and Clayton had looked at that family and decided that the cost of staying quiet was too high. He had gone to the sheriff. The sheriff had been more interested in the information than he had let on, and within 3 months there had been a federal case, and within 6 months Denton Voss had been convicted of cattle theft on a scale substantial enough to earn him 7 years in the Texas State Penitentiary. Clayton had moved north. He had moved carefully and thoroughly north, changing his route several times, working for a season in Colorado before drifting east into Kansas, buying the parcel of land outside Millhaven in the spring of 1876 with the money he had saved over years of itinerant ranch work. He had built a small house. He had started a small herd. He had begun, slowly, and with the caution of someone who understands that safety is provisional, to believe that he might be allowed to stay. Denton Voss was released from the Texas State Penitentiary in October of 1878, 2 weeks before the Millhaven social, having served 5 years of his 7-year sentence. Clayton did not know this yet on the night of the social. He had not known it the morning after either, when he rode into town early, before Sutter's Dry Goods was properly open, and knocked on the side door that led up to Hazel's 2 rooms above the barber shop. She answered it in her everyday dress with her hair half done, and for a moment she stared at him with the expression of someone who is recalibrating rapidly. "Mr. Sheridan," she said. "Clayton," he said. He held up the paper bag in his hand. "I brought sweet rolls from Mrs. Penny's kitchen. She had extras." There was a pause in which Hazel appeared to make several internal calculations simultaneously. "Come up," she said. Her 2 rooms were exactly as spare and functional as he would have expected. A sitting room with a table, 2 chairs, a small bookshelf holding a Bible, a domestic almanac, and 3 novels whose spines showed considerable rereading, and a potbelly stove that was currently doing a good job against the November morning. The door to the second room was pulled closed. It was the most personal space he had been in since arriving in Millhaven, and he was aware of being in it with a kind of careful awareness. She put water on to boil and they sat at the table and ate sweet rolls, and it was the most naturally comfortable breakfast Clayton Sheridan had experienced in longer than he could easily account for. "Why?" she said after a while. "Why what? Why me?" At the social. She said it directly, without accusation or self-pity, the way she said most things, plainly and meaning it. "There are women in this town who are considerably more—" "I know what you're going to say," he said. "And I want you to hear me clearly when I tell you that the word you're about to use is wrong." "Plain," she said. "I was going to say plain." "I know." He looked at her with the Winter Creek eyes she had been cataloging for months. "You are not plain, Hazel, not to me, not even close. Don't say things you don't mean to be kind." "I'm not kind," he said. "I'm honest. There's a difference." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You have a face that shows you've been through things. That's not plain. That's earned. You have hands that know how to work. You have a mind that doesn't stop and wait for permission to have opinions. You looked at me the day with the shutter hook like I was a person you had already decided to take seriously. You have no idea how rare that is." She was quiet. He could see her receiving the words with the caution of someone who has been disappointed before, weighing them, testing the weight of them. "3 months," she said again. "3 months," he agreed. "I've been thinking about how to say all of that correctly for 3 months. Did you get it right?" "I don't know yet," he said. "Did I?" She looked at him for a long moment, and then the corner of her mouth moved, and it was the real thing, the one he had been watching for. "You got most of it right," she said. They talked for 2 hours that morning. About Missouri, which she described without sentimentality. The farm, the drought years, her father's illness, the way the land had finally simply refused to continue producing, and the bank had been unsurprised. About what had brought her to Kansas in general and Millhaven in particular, the chain of small practical decisions that had led to Margaret Sutter's advertisement in the Dodge City Times and her answer to it. She talked about work, about the accounts she had streamlined at Sutter's, and the inventory system she had created that Margaret had initially resisted and then adopted completely. She talked about books, about which of the 3 novels on the shelf she had read most recently and why. She talked about the Callaway boy, who had started leaving small tokens on the step outside the dry goods store, a smooth pebble, a feather, a twist of dried grass, as a form of thanks that was more eloquent than words. She did not talk about loneliness, but it was there in the room between them anyway, the way important things always are when 2 people who have each been carrying them for a long time finally end up in the same space. He did not talk about Denton Voss. He came back the next Saturday afternoon, and they walked along the creek that ran south of town, bare-branched cottonwoods on either side, and the water running low and cold, and clear over flat limestone shelves. She wore her heavy coat and her practical boots, and they walked until their breath made small clouds in the air, and talked until Hazel realized she had said more things in one afternoon than she had said in the previous month combined. He came back the Saturday after that, and this time they stayed at the table in her rooms, and she read to him from one of her novels, a story set in a place neither of them would ever go, and he listened with the quality of attention that makes a person feel visible. And on the 3rd Saturday, when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that makes the Kansas plain feel like the edge of the world, he arrived at her side door with the bag from Mrs. Penny's kitchen and a carefully folded newspaper, and his face was different. Not frightened, exactly. She did not think she had ever seen fear on his face, and she did not quite see it now. But there was something tightly controlled in it, something that had not been there the previous weeks, a coiled tension behind the steady eyes that made her stomach go cold before she understood why. "Come in," she said. He came in. He set the bag on the table. He set the newspaper beside it. He sat down in the chair that had become his and he looked at her, and then he told her about Denton Voss. He told her all of it, from the Rafter Sea operation to the Prout family to the county sheriff, to the federal case, to the 5 years in the Texas State Penitentiary. He told it without inflection, without apology, without the self-dramatizing that men sometimes use when they are trying to make their past sound more heroic than complicated, and she listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How long have you known he was released?" "I don't know for certain that he has been," he said. "But his sentence was 7 years starting November of 1873, and 2 weeks ago would have been 5 years, and sentences are reduced for behavior," she said. "Yes, and you think he'd come here. I think he's the kind of man who considers accounts to be things that need settling." He looked at the table. "He has people, Hazel. People who are loyal to him. They know how to find a man who's trying not to be found, and I've been here long enough that I haven't been careful enough." She was quiet for a moment. She was not afraid, which surprised her, or rather she was afraid, but she was also thinking, and the thinking was stronger than the fear. "Who else knows," she said, "about your past, about Voss?" "No one in Millhaven." "You should tell the sheriff," she said. He looked at her. "Bill Cook has been the sheriff of this county for 6 years, and I've never once seen him do anything that complicated," she said. "But he should still know, and there are other people who could help." "You're not telling me to leave," he said. "No," she said. "You could. You have every reason to." She looked at him with the dark brown eyes that he had come to think of as the most honest eyes he had ever encountered, the eyes that did not permit comfortable fictions. "I have every reason to want you to stay," she said. "Whether that's wise or not is a question I've already asked myself and answered." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and it was the first time he had touched her since the dance, and the warmth of it went straight through her like the first day of spring after a hard winter. "I'm going to handle it," he said. "We," she said. "Hazel." "We," she said again more firmly. "That's not negotiable." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him wanting to argue, the reflexive independence of a man who has been alone with his own problems for a long time, and then she saw him decide not to. "We," he said. The following week, Clayton rode into Millhaven on a Tuesday, which was not his usual day, and had a long conversation with Sheriff Bill Cook in Cook's narrow office behind the post office. He told the sheriff what he had told Hazel. The sheriff, to his credit, took it more seriously than his reputation might have suggested, and wrote 2 letters, one to the Texas state authorities inquiring about Denton Voss's current status, and one to the federal marshal's office in Dodge City. The letters went out on Wednesday's stage. The reply that came back the following Monday was delivered directly to Clayton, who was at Sutter's Dry Goods when the stage came in, standing at the counter helping Hazel recount a shipment of nails that had arrived short by 40 pounds. The reply was from the federal marshal's office. It confirmed that Denton Voss had been released from the Texas State Penitentiary on October the 14th. It noted that as of the date of writing, Voss's whereabouts were unknown. It recommended that Clayton report any contact or sighting immediately. Hazel read the letter over his shoulder. He felt her breath steady against his neck. "October 14th, she said. 6 weeks ago," he said. "He's had 6 weeks to find you." Yes. They both knew what that meant. Millhaven was not a large place. A man with resources and the kind of people who owed him loyalty could find a homesteader in a small Kansas town in 6 weeks without straining himself. Hazel folded the letter and handed it back to him. "You should stay in town tonight," she said. "Your ranch is too far out. If he comes and you're not here, you won't know." "I can't stay in your rooms, Hazel, that would—" "I know that," she said, with the particular patience she used when she was about to say something practical that he was not going to be able to argue with. "There's a room at Mrs. Penny's boarding house. She had a vacancy last week. I'll speak to her." "You've already thought this through," he said. "I started thinking it through last Saturday," she said. "I thought we agreed that was what we do now." He looked at her in the particular way that she was beginning to recognize, the way that meant he was feeling something too large and complicated to fit into words, and was grateful that she existed to make that all right. "We did," he said. He took the room at Mrs. Penny's. He rode out to his ranch during the days to maintain his herd with the help of a young hand named Joseph Aldridge, who had been working for him since the summer, and who was reliable in the specific way of young men who have something to prove. He came back to town by dark. And every evening for a week, he and Hazel ate supper together at the table in her 2 rooms above the barber shop, and talked, and did not talk about Denton Voss, and talked about Denton Voss when it was necessary, and built something between them that had the quality of a thing that has been constructed carefully by people who know that care is what makes things last. On the 7th evening he kissed her. It was not dramatic. They were standing by the potbelly stove after supper, both holding their coffee cups, talking about something ordinary, and he turned toward her and she turned toward him, and the distance between them, which had been decreasing in small increments for 7 evenings, simply resolved itself. His mouth was warm and deliberate and unhurried, and she kissed him back the way she did most things, fully, without pretense or performance, meaning it. When they separated, she was holding her coffee cup so tightly she could feel the heat of it through the tin. "I've been thinking about doing that since the waltz," he said. "That was 2 weeks ago," she said. "I'm aware," he said. "You are genuinely terrible at being prompt about things," she said. He laughed, and she felt the sound of it as a physical warmth, and then he kissed her again, and neither of them said anything for quite some time after that. Denton Voss arrived in Millhaven on a Thursday, 10 days after the letter from the federal marshal's office, 6 days after the second kiss by the potbelly stove. He came in on horseback, which meant he came quietly, and he did not come to the main street. He came to the livery first, which was at the south end of town on the road that came up from the Oklahoma Territory, and the man running the livery that morning was a young fellow named Ellis who was new to the job, and did not think to ask careful questions of a well-dressed stranger who paid in cash for his horse's care. Clayton first heard that there was a stranger in town from Joseph Aldridge, who had ridden in that morning to pick up a part for the wagon and had passed the livery on his way and noticed the horse being led inside. Joseph noticed details. It was the thing Clayton had liked about him from the beginning. Joseph found Clayton at Mrs. Penny's boarding house before 8 in the morning and described the stranger. Tall, well-dressed for the territory, dark hat, a particular way of carrying himself that Joseph could not quite articulate but that he associated, he said somewhat apologetically, with authority, like a man who is used to people doing what he says. Clayton was at Sutter's Dry Goods in 8 minutes. Hazel saw him come in and knew immediately from the set of his shoulders. "He's here," she said. "Possibly," he said. He came around the counter and stood close enough to speak quietly. "I need you to do something for me." "Name it," she said. "Send word to Sheriff Cook, right now before anything else." "I'll send Pete Calloway," she said. "He's faster than sending a note." She looked at him steadily. "And what are you going to do?" "I'm going to be visible," he said. "I'm going to be exactly where I always am on a Thursday morning, which is here in this store talking to you. If it is Voss, I want him to come to me in a public place with witnesses. And if he doesn't, then I'll be at Mrs. Penny's tonight and we'll lock the door," he said. She reached under the counter and found Pete Calloway's things, the boy's battered hat that he always left at the Dry Goods when he went to the telegraph office. She came around the counter and walked to the door. "Hazel," Clayton said. She turned. "I need to tell you something," he said. "In case, tell me after," she said. "Tell me everything after and I'll listen to all of it. Right now let me go find Pete." She went out. She found Pete Calloway at the telegraph office, which was 3 buildings down, and told him quietly and clearly that he needed to go directly to Sheriff Cook, and tell the sheriff that Clayton Sheridan's visitor might be in town, and that Mr. Sheridan was at Sutter's Dry Goods, and could the sheriff please come by at his earliest convenience, meaning immediately. Pete, who had been trying to repay a debt to Hazel Brooks and Clayton Sheridan for 3 months, was gone at a full run before she finished her sentence. She walked back to the dry goods. Denton Voss came through the front door 7 minutes later. Hazel had never seen him before, but she would have known him from Clayton's description alone. Tall, composed, with the careful stillness of a man who has spent 5 years in a place where any expression of feeling is a liability. He was perhaps 50, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and he was well dressed for a man who had been riding through Kansas, which meant he had planned this appearance the way an actor plans a scene. He looked at Clayton, then he looked at Hazel, then he looked at Clayton again. "Been a while," he said. "Voss," Clayton said. He was standing beside the far counter, and he had not moved since she came back in, had not shifted his weight or reached for anything or done anything that could be interpreted as a threat. He was just standing there, steady and visible, the way he had planned. "You're a hard man to find," Voss said. "Took me most of the past 6 weeks." His eyes moved around the store with the evaluating quality of a man accustomed to calculating the value of a situation. "Nice little town you've got. Kansas suits you. What do you want, Voss?" "A conversation," Voss said. "Just that." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonableness that did not reach his eyes. "I've had 5 years to do my thinking, Sheridan. A man does a lot of thinking in a place like that." "I expect so," Clayton said. "I decided something," Voss said. "I decided the score's already been settled. The federal government settled it with 5 years of my life. I'm not here to add to that balance." He looked at Clayton with a flatness that was more unsettling than anger would have been. "I want you to know that I know exactly where you are. I wanted to see your face when I told you that. That's all." The door behind him opened, and Sheriff Cook came in with a quiet efficiency that was, Hazel reflected, the most impressive thing she had seen him manage in 3 years. Voss turned, assessed the situation without apparent surprise, and turned back to Clayton. "I'll be gone by noon," he said. He looked once more at Hazel, a look she could not entirely read, but that felt like recalculation. "Your woman has good instincts. The boy who ran for the law." He said it without rancor, almost with approval. "Smart." He walked out past Sheriff Cook, who let him go, and then looked at Clayton with an expression that was equal parts relief and the desire to never deal with anything like this again. "Is that it?" the sheriff said. "I don't know yet," Clayton said, "but it was mostly." The federal marshal's office in Dodge City, having received the sheriff's telegram about Voss's appearance in Millhaven, sent a man the following week to confirm Voss's whereabouts and intentions, and to make clear to Denton Voss in the specific official language that the federal government employs when it wants to make something very clear indeed, that Clayton Sheridan was a protected witness, and any contact or intimidation would be considered a federal offense, with consequences that made 5 years in the Texas State Penitentiary look like a comfortable alternative. Voss was found in Dodge City. He was interviewed by the federal marshal. He did not return to Millhaven. Clayton heard about it by letter 3 weeks later, standing at the table in Hazel's 2 rooms above the barbershop with the afternoon light coming through the window and turning everything gold, and he read the letter twice and then set it down and looked at her. "It's done," he said. She looked back at him. She had not allowed herself to fully exhale since the Thursday morning with Denton Voss in the dry goods store, had kept a carefully banked tension behind her everyday demeanor that she suspected Clayton had noticed but had known better than to comment on. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he said. "He's not coming back." She let out the breath. It was the kind of exhale that comes from deep in the body, from the place where stored fear lives, and it took a moment to complete. "Good," she said. He crossed the room and took her face in his hands and kissed her with the kind of thoroughness that contains everything that has been held back for a long time, and she kissed him back in the same way, and they stood there by the window in the afternoon light until Mrs. Penny's clock, which could be heard through the floor of the rooms above the barbershop if the building was quiet enough, chimed 4 o'clock. "Hazel," he said when they separated. "Yes," she said. "I need to tell you the thing I was going to tell you before when I said in case." "I know," she said. "I love you," he said. He said it the way he said most important things, directly, without the decorations that make a statement easier to take back. I have been trying to figure out how to tell you that since the waltz, and I have been entirely unsuccessful at managing it sooner, which is the single thing I'm most ashamed of in my recent history. She looked at him with the brown eyes that did not permit comfortable fictions. I love you too, she said. I have been waiting for you to say it first because I was not sure, and now I am sure and I love you. You were sure before, he said. I was very nearly sure, she said. That's different. He laughed again, the real laugh, the one she had been collecting like the Calloway boys' small tokens, each one a thing to hold and keep. When I said there was something I needed to tell you, he said. That was the other thing I needed to tell you. Not just Hazel, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that there is no pressure, none at all, and you can take whatever time you need. Yes, she said. He stopped. You haven't asked yet, he said. I know, she said, but I know what you're going to ask, and yes. He studied her face. You are very sure for someone who claims not to have been sure, he said. I'm sure about this, she said. I have been sure about this for considerably longer than I would like to admit. He took her hands, both of them, and held them the way you hold something you have been afraid of losing and have finally understood you are allowed to keep. Will you marry me, Hazel Brooks? He said. Yes, she said again, and this time she let herself feel the full weight of the word, let it settle into her completely, all the warmth and terrifying hope of it. They were married in December. It was not a large wedding by the standards of what weddings could be. It was the kind of wedding that a practical woman and an honest man plan together, when both of them have spent years without excess and are not sure they entirely trust it. The church at the north end of Millhaven's Main Street, the minister Reverend Cross, who had a good voice and said the important words without excessive embellishment, Margaret Sutter in her good dress, sitting in the front pew with the expression of someone whose plans have come to precisely the conclusion they intended, young Pete Calloway in a clean shirt looking solemn and proud, Joseph Aldridge standing up for Clayton because there was no one else, and because Joseph had earned the right with 6 weeks of quiet, reliable competence in the face of complicated circumstances. Hazel wore the blue dress, which she had altered to fit the occasion with 3 days of careful sewing, and a length of white ribbon that she had kept in her sewing bag for 2 years without knowing what it was waiting for. She stood at the front of the small church and watched Clayton walk toward her down the short aisle, and he was looking at her with the Winter Creek eyes and the expression that she had by now learned to read completely, the expression that said she was the only landmark in a flat and featureless plain, and she thought, this is the thing I did not believe was coming. This is the thing that happened anyway. Reverend Cross said the words. Clayton said his. Hazel said hers, clearly and without hesitation, looking directly at him because she had decided that she was done with looking away from things she wanted. He kissed her at the part where it was indicated, and the small congregation, which also included Mrs. Penny and the Calloway family and 4 women from the sewing circle, who had been watching the whole development of events with the intense satisfaction of people who have had a theory proven correct, made the appropriate sounds. They drove out to the ranch afterward, the 2 of them in the wagon with the cold December air sharp and clean, the Kansas plain stretching out in every direction under a pale winter sky. The house was small, a front room with a good stove and a table and chairs Clayton had made himself, a kitchen behind it, a bedroom with a real bed that he had purchased from a furniture maker in Dodge City in the autumn with, Hazel realized, considerable premeditation. She stood in the middle of the front room and turned slowly and took in all of it. It needs some things, he said behind her. I've never been much for the interior of a house. I expect you'll have opinions. I have several already, she said. I look forward to them, he said. She turned and looked at him in his good coat in the doorway of the small house on the Kansas plain, her husband, and felt something she had not felt in so long that it took her a moment to name it. She felt safe. Not the brittle false safety of keeping yourself small enough that nothing notices you. The real kind. The kind that comes from being known. Winter turned, as Kansas winters do, slowly and reluctantly, with several false starts and at least 2 additional snowstorms after everyone had decided that spring was finally coming. But come it did. The cottonwoods along the creek put out their pale green, and the prairie grass went from silver brown to vivid and alive, and Hazel planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, while Clayton expanded the herd with 2 new purchases from a ranch near Abilene. She continued working at Sutter's Dry Goods 3 days a week, which she had discussed with Clayton before the wedding and which he had supported without reservation, understanding correctly that Hazel Brooks, Hazel Sheridan now, a name she tried on privately several times a day for the first weeks before it settled, was not a woman whose particular competencies ought to be reduced to the domestic alone. Margaret Sutter, who was getting on in years and whose knees were increasingly problematic, was quietly relieved. Margaret had a conversation with Hazel in March, during a slow afternoon when the store was empty, and the early spring light came through the unshuttered windows at a low golden angle. "You know what I thought when you first came in off that stage," Margaret said. "What?" Hazel said, looking up from the accounts book. "I thought, here is a woman who has made herself small for safety," Margaret said. "And I thought, someone is going to have to show her she doesn't need to anymore." Hazel looked at her. "Did you plan all of this?" she said. Margaret's expression was entirely innocent in the specific way of someone who has planned most things and regrets nothing. "I may have mentioned to Clayton Sheridan about 4 months before the social that you were the most capable woman in Millhaven and the most undervalued, and that a man of sense would do something about that," she said. "Just in conversation." "Margaret." "The waltz was entirely his own idea," Margaret said. "I want credit for nothing more than pointing him in the right direction." Hazel set down her pen. She looked out the window at the Spring Street at Pete Calloway running some errand at the flags of the general store opposite snapping in the March wind at the life of the town proceeding around her. "Thank you," she said. Margaret made a dismissive gesture that contained a great deal of warmth. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just keep doing what you're doing, both of you." Spring became summer. The ranch expanded steadily. Clayton had a gift for cattle that was not flashy but was thorough, a deep practical knowledge of what a herd needed and when and how to provide it. Joseph Aldridge became a permanent fixture, living in the small bunkhouse that Clayton built in June, and he and Clayton worked together with the comfortable efficiency of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms. Hazel drove out to the ranch 4 mornings a week, early enough to have breakfast with Clayton before he went out to the range, and she came back to town for her Sutter's days and spent the remaining time at the ranch with her garden and her books and the increasingly elaborate plans she had for a set of curtains in the front room. She ordered the curtain fabric from Dodge City in July. It arrived in August, in the same week that Hazel understood, from the specific evidence of her own body with which she had become quietly familiar, that she was going to have a child. She told Clayton on a Sunday evening. They were sitting on the narrow porch he had built on the front of the house in June, watching the sunset do its excessive Kansas business across the western sky. She waited until the most theatrical part of the color had passed and then turned to him on her chair. "I have something to tell you," she said. He looked at her. "We're going to have a baby," she said. His face did something she had never seen it do before. It opened, simply and completely, the way a door opens when someone who has been standing outside finally has a key, and everything he had held carefully for years came through it in a single moment. The relief and the love and the hope and the specific terror of wanting something enormously and knowing that wanting it does not protect it. "Hazel," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm fairly certain. April, I think." He reached over and took her hand. He held it for a long time without saying anything else, looking out at the prairie in the falling dark, and she sat with him in the quiet and let it be enough, because it was. He turned to her eventually and said very quietly, "I'm going to be someone's father." "Yes," she said. "I've never—" He stopped, started again. "My own father left when I was 7. I've never had an example of the right way to do it. You have been taking care of things and people your entire life, she said. You took care of the Prout family when you didn't have to. You took care of a child you didn't know in front of the livery with nothing but your presence and your voice. You take care of Joseph and the herd and the ranch, and you take care of me, not by making me smaller or protected, but by making me feel like there is room in the world for all of me. She looked at him steadily. You will be an extraordinary father. I'm very sure about this. He looked at her for a long moment in the way that she had learned to receive, the way that meant he was feeling something too large for words and was grateful she existed to make that all right. How do you do that? He said. Do what? Know exactly what I need to hear and say it without making it feel smaller for having been said. Practice, she said. I've been practicing on you since the shutter hook. He laughed, and she laughed with him, and the last light of the Kansas evening settled over them on the porch of the small ranch house, and it was, she thought, the most beautiful thing she had ever seen that was not looking at him. The autumn was good. The fall roundup went well, and Clayton sold a portion of his herd at favorable prices at the Abilene market, which gave them more solid financial footing than they had yet enjoyed and allowed for the expansion of the house that they had been discussing since August. A proper kitchen addition and a second bedroom, because a second bedroom was going to be necessary. A local carpenter named Webb, who was steady and competent and charged reasonable prices, started the work in October and finished it by the first week of November, which was exactly 1 year since the social. On the anniversary of the social, Clayton came in from the range at midday and found Hazel in the new kitchen, which still smelled of cut pine and fresh plaster, looking out the window at the prairie. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "A year ago today," she said. "You walked across that room." "I almost didn't," he said. She turned. "I was standing in the doorway for a full minute before I came in," he said. "I almost talked myself out of it. I had a very convincing internal argument for why it was too soon and too uncertain and too much to ask." "What changed your mind?" "You were standing against the wall in the blue dress," he said, "and you looked—" He paused, and she let him find it. "You looked like someone who had decided not to expect anything good," he said, "and I couldn't stand it. I couldn't leave you standing there like that." She looked at him across the new kitchen with its unshuttered windows and its smell of fresh pine, 7 months along now, the evidence of their spring entirely visible, and she felt the familiar warmth of him, of the specific life they had constructed together piece by piece in the way that things are constructed when you know that care is what makes them last. "I'm glad you didn't leave me standing there," she said. "So am I," he said. He came across the kitchen and put his arms around her carefully, mindfully, the way he did everything now, and she leaned into him and looked out the window at the November prairie, the grass gone silver again, the sky the particular pale blue of a Kansas autumn, all of it enormous and beautiful and hers. The baby was born in April, in the second year of the Sheridans' marriage, on a Thursday morning that arrived with a late spring snow that dusted the new grass and melted by afternoon. Margaret Sutter drove out from town with the midwife, a calm, capable woman named Mrs. Dort, who had delivered approximately 40 children in the county and approached each one with professional serenity. Joseph Aldridge paced the area around the bunkhouse with the anxious energy of someone who has been told his job is to stay out of the way and is finding it difficult. Clayton stayed close, in the way that a man stays close when he has decided that proximity is the only thing he can offer and it must be enough. He held Hazel's hand through the morning, and she held his back with the grip that she later estimated was probably painful but that he never mentioned. The baby was a boy. He was a substantial, healthy boy with a ferocious set of lungs that he used immediately and without restraint, and when the midwife handed him to Hazel and Clayton came to sit beside them on the bed, Clayton looked at his son with the open face, the door-flung wide face, and said nothing for almost a full minute. "Hello," he said finally to the baby. The baby regarded him with the unfocused but intense expression of the very newly arrived. "His name," Hazel said. They had talked about names. They had talked about it at length over the past months, with the serious attention that they brought to most things. "James," Clayton said, "if you still want." "James Robert Sheridan," Hazel said. Robert had been her father's name, the father with the long dying and the failed homestead and the love, fierce and inarticulate, that she had carried out of Missouri along with her trunk and her cloth sewing bag. It seemed right to give it somewhere to live. "James Robert Sheridan," Clayton said, and looked at his son, and then at his wife, and then at the window where the spring snow was already yielding to sun, and whatever he was feeling was too large for words and she did not require them. Margaret Sutter held the baby before she left and pronounced him excellent, which was the highest praise Margaret dispensed. Life at the Sheridan Ranch settled into the rhythms of a life that is full, the particular fullness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of people you love and work you find meaningful, and a place that has become genuinely yours. James grew. He grew with the speed that children employ that always surprises their parents, from the ferocious newborn to a curious, steady-footed boy who walked early and talked continuously, and had, from the time he could manage sustained observation, his father's habit of watching doors. Hazel continued at Sutter's 3 days a week until James was 2, and then transitioned to 2 days a week. And then, when Margaret's knees became genuinely prohibitive in the winter of James's 2nd year, she helped Margaret arrange the sale of the store to a young couple from Wichita named the Garveys, and took on a smaller role as an informal accountant for several of the town's businesses, work she could do partly at home and partly in town, and that suited the particular shape of her days. Margaret Sutter retired to a small house on the edge of Millhaven's Main Street, and received visitors with the imperious graciousness of someone who has arranged things satisfactorily and knows it. Clayton's ranch grew steadily. Not extravagantly, not with the aggressive expansion that characterized some of the larger Kansas operations that were beginning to consume the smaller homesteads around them in those years, but solidly, reliably, in the patient way of a man who has learned that sustainable is better than spectacular. He hired 2 more hands in addition to Joseph, both good young men, one of them a quiet fellow named Marcus who had come up from Texas, and who brought with him a skill with horses that bordered on extraordinary. Joseph Aldridge, in the 3rd year of working for Clayton, married a woman named Clara who had come to Millhaven with her widowed mother and who had, Hazel noticed with quiet satisfaction, the same quality of directness that she had always valued in people. She was present when Joseph asked Clayton's permission to be absent from the ranch on a Thursday afternoon for the purpose of asking Clara to marry him, and she watched Clayton not quite manage to suppress his amusement at being asked permission for something that required no permission, and say yes with the appropriate gravity. Clara Aldridge became a friend, the particular kind of friend that women on the Kansas plain made of each other, practical, honest, present. She and Hazel talked across fence posts and kitchen tables about the things that were immediate and the things that were not, about the state of the territory and the condition of the road from town, and the growing debates about whether the large cattle operations moving in from the east were going to make small ranching untenable, a question that preoccupied Clayton more than he always let on. The question resolved itself, as many of the harder questions of those years did, not with any clean political resolution but with time and adaptation, and the specific stubbornness of people who have decided their place is theirs. The Sheridan Ranch developed a reputation for quality that insulated it from some of the pressure, and Clayton's careful management of his debts and his relationships meant that when the harder years came, in the mid-1880s when prices fell and the drought returned in some of its old cruelty, they weathered it without losing what they had built. James, at 4, wanted to know everything about everything, particularly about the horses, and Clayton spent his Saturday afternoons introducing his son to every aspect of the ranch's operation, with the patient thoroughness of a man who has decided that a child deserves to understand the world rather than simply inhabit it. Hazel watched them sometimes from the kitchen window, the tall figure and the small one moving together across the ranch yard. The boy's face tipped up toward his father's, and felt something she had no adequate word for, something warm and specific and entirely her own. In the spring of James's 4th year, which was the 5th year of Hazel and Clayton's marriage, Hazel became pregnant again. She told Clayton on a Sunday evening on the porch in the same spot where she had told him the first time, watching the same excessive Kansas sunset. He took her hand in the same way and held it for a long time and then turned to her. "I was beginning to think James was it," he said. "So was I," she said. "I didn't mind, but I don't mind this either." "Are you well?" he said. "Very," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to it, a gesture she had not expected from him the first time he had done it, years ago now, and had come to understand was the gesture he used when words were not sufficient. This baby came in October, which was a better time than April for a Kansas birth in that you did not have to hope that the late snow would melt before afternoon. A girl this time, delivered by Mrs. Dort with the same professional serenity, welcomed by a 4-year-old James who had been told he was going to have a sibling, and had developed strong and specific opinions about what that would involve. They named her Eleanor Margaret Sheridan, the second name for Margaret Sutter, who received the news in her small house on the edge of Millhaven's Main Street, and said nothing for a full 30 seconds, and then said that it was a very fine name, and she was much obliged, which was as close as Margaret Sutter came to emotional overflow. Eleanor was different from James in nearly every particular. Where he had been steady and deliberate, she was quick and mercurial. Where he had been content to watch before acting, she acted first and examined the consequences with interest afterward. She had Hazel's dark eyes and Clayton's square jaw, and a temperament that was entirely her own. And she was walking at 9 months and getting into things at 10 months, and by 12 months had established herself as the gravitational center of the Sheridan household, around which all other activity was organized. James adored her from the first day, with the kind of absolute uncomplicated devotion that some older siblings produce and others do not, and it settled into a bond between them that Hazel and Clayton watched develop over the years with the particular pleasure of parents who see their children choose to love each other. Clayton taught them both about the ranch as they grew. He taught them both about animals and land and weather, about the difference between a drought coming and a drought breaking, about the way a herd behaves when something is wrong before the wrong thing becomes visible. He taught them the practical skills that a life on the Kansas plain required. James how to rope by age 7, Eleanor how to read a weather sky before she was 6, both of them how to handle horses with the respect that Marcus had been modeling since they were old enough to stand in the barn. Hazel taught them what she could from her own particular store, numbers and accounts, because the world ran on both and a person who understood money was less likely to be undone by it. She taught them how to read contracts, how to listen carefully, how to ask the question that gets to the thing underneath the thing. She taught Eleanor to sew, not because it was required of women, but because it was useful for anyone who needed to understand how things were constructed and repaired. She taught James to cook for the same reason. And she taught them both, not in words because some things cannot be taught in words, but in the example of her own life, that what you look like on the outside of a room is not what determines your worth inside it. That showing up is more than most people do. That the right person will walk across the room before the music starts. Clayton said to her once in the 7th year of their marriage, lying in the dark of their bedroom with the prairie wind doing its usual work outside and the children asleep and the ranch quiet, "Do you ever think about where you'd be if you hadn't gone to the social that night?" She thought about it. "Against a different wall," she said. "In a different town, possibly, still keeping careful account of what was available versus what I wanted. And the difference? You," she said. "The difference is you." He was quiet. "I almost didn't go," he said. "I was almost sure it was too soon, too uncertain." "You told me," she said. "What made me go," he said, "was that I thought, what is it that I am actually afraid of?" And the answer was not her. The answer was everything else. The answer was Voss and the years of moving and the not being sure I was allowed to stay. And I decided that I was not going to let the things that had happened to me take the thing I wanted most. She turned toward him in the dark. "That's the bravest thing you've ever told me," she said. "I've done braver things," he said. "No," she said, "you haven't." He pulled her close, the way he had done for 7 years now, the way that had never lost the quality of something deliberately chosen, and she settled against him with the ease of a person who has found the exact place they are supposed to be and understood that they are allowed to stay in it. The years continued in their way, full, particular, real. James grew into a young man with his father's steadiness and his mother's precision, and a gift for the business side of ranching that pleased Clayton enormously, and would have embarrassed James if he had known how much. Alina grew into a young woman with her mother's directness and her father's patience, which was a combination that various people across the county would eventually discover was extremely effective in any negotiation. She had a talent for music, which neither of her parents could entirely account for, and had been playing the piano in the Millhaven church since she was 8 years old, to the considerable satisfaction of Reverend Cross's successor, a younger man named Matthews who appreciated the specific quality of playing that sounds like it means something. Margaret Sutter died in the winter of James's 14th year and Alina's 10th, peacefully, in her own bed in her small house at the edge of town. At an age she had never entirely specified, but that Hazel estimated was somewhere in the region of 75. She left the small house and its contents to the Garvey family's oldest daughter, who had been helping her for 2 years, and she left Hazel a note that was 3 sentences long and characteristically direct. "You were the best thing to come through my store. You would have been fine regardless, but I'm glad he walked across the room. Keep doing what you're doing." Hazel folded the note and kept it in the small wooden box on her bureau where she kept other things that mattered. A smooth pebble from the Calloway boys' earliest repayments, the piece of white ribbon from her wedding dress, a letter from Clayton written during one of his rare cattle-buying trips in the 3rd year of their marriage that said, in his economical handwriting, that he had bought the cattle and was coming home, and that home was not a place, but a person, and the person was her. She stood at Margaret Sutter's grave in the Millhaven cemetery on the March day they buried her, with the wind doing what March winds do on the Kansas plain, and James on one side of her, and Alina on the other, and Clayton standing close behind her with his hand warm on the small of her back. And she thought about the woman who had put an advertisement in the Dodge City Times and hired a plain woman from Missouri and spent the following years arranging things with the patient confidence of someone who knows what they are doing. "She was remarkable," Hazel said. "Yes," Clayton said. "I'm going to miss her every day," she said. "Yes," he said again. He had known Margaret Sutter well enough by then to know that was the truth, not sentiment. She took a breath of the cold March air and felt the weight of his hand and the warmth of her children on either side of her, and she was sad in the real way, the way that comes from genuine loss, and she was also full in the way that is not incompatible with sadness when you have enough of what you love to hold you up through the losing. The ride back to the ranch from the cemetery was quiet in the way of a family that has learned to be comfortable in each other's silences. James drove the wagon with the careful competence he brought to everything. Alina sat beside him and looked at the prairie with whatever young thoughts she was thinking, and Hazel and Clayton sat behind them in the wagon bed, watching their children and the vast open sky, and the grass coming green at the edges where the sun had been strongest. "What are you thinking?" Clayton said, the question he had been asking her since the first winter of their marriage, the one that always got an honest answer. "That I'm grateful," she said, "for all of it, even the hard parts, maybe especially the hard parts. Because they brought you here," he said. "Because they showed me what I was made of," she said, "and then here brought me people to be made of something for." He put his arm around her there in the wagon bed with the wind in their faces and their children in front of them and the Kansas plain stretching out in all directions, enormous and specific in theirs. "I love you, Hazel Sheridan," he said. She leaned into him. "I love you, Clayton Sheridan," she said. "I have since the shutter hook. I've been sure about it since the waltz. I've been certain since you walked across that room." "Before the music started," he said. "Before the music started," she agreed. They rode home in the late afternoon light, the wagon rolling over the familiar road, the ranch coming into view with its extended house, and its tidy yard and its barn, where Marcus was certainly already settling the horses for the evening, and the smell of good land, and coming spring in the air. And Hazel Brooks, who had come to Millhaven, Kansas in the spring of 1878, with one trunk and a cloth sewing bag and no expectation of being seen, felt the full particular rightness of a life that had gone to exactly the places it was supposed to go. James pulled the wagon up to the house and jumped down and held a hand up for Alina, who accepted it with the absent ease of a sister, who has been accepting and ignoring her brother's assistance in equal measure since she could walk. Clayton climbed down and held his hand up for Hazel, and she took it the way she had taken his hand the first time, in the social hall with the room watching and the fiddle tuning, and the music not yet started. She stepped down onto the ground of the place that was hers. The evening came in its ordinary beautiful way. Supper, which was a joint production because Sundays were joint productions, and the talk around the table that was specific and real, not the polite surface conversation of people who are obligated to share a table, but the actual ongoing narration of four people interested in each other's lives. James talked about the new fencing he was planning with one of the ranch hands, and why the timber they had been using was inadequate, and what he intended to do about it. Alina played 3 pieces on the small upright piano that had come to the ranch in the 5th year of the marriage, and had been Alina's particular joy since she was old enough to reach the keys, the music filling the warm front room and going out through the windows into the spring evening. Clayton washed the dishes, which was his habit on Sundays because Hazel did more than her share of the other 6 days, and she sat at the table with her accounts book and her lamp, and did what she had always done, the columns of numbers and the careful work of making sure everything added up. She looked up after a while and found him watching her from across the kitchen, dish towel in hand, with the expression she had been receiving for going on 10 years now. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." "Still," she said. "Always," he said. She shook her head, smiling, and looked back at her accounts book. The lamp was warm. The kitchen smelled of the supper they had made together. Outside, the Kansas evening was doing what Kansas evenings do, going down in a slow extravagance of color, the sky putting on its show for no one in particular and everyone who happened to be looking. She had, she thought, been the plainest woman at the social, and a man had walked across the room before the music started and held out his hand, and she had taken it, and every road that had come after led here. To this kitchen, this lamp, these children sleeping upstairs now with the particular deep sleep of the young, this man who had never once required her to be anything other than exactly what she was. She thought of Margaret Sutter's note in the wooden box on the bureau upstairs. "You would have been fine regardless." That was true, she believed it. She had been resilient enough to be fine. But this, the life on the other side of the door that had cracked open in the social hall on a November night in 1878, was not fine. It was extraordinary. It was the specific, irreplaceable, daily extraordinary of a life that is genuinely full. She closed the accounts book. "Clayton," she said. He looked up. "Come sit with me," she said. He hung up the dish towel and came and sat down across the table from her, and they stayed there in the lamplight for a long time, talking about nothing in particular and everything that mattered, the way they had been doing for 10 years, the way she intended to keep doing for every year that followed, because this was the thing she had found on the other side of the door, and she was not going to take a single evening of it for granted. Outside, the Kansas plain settled into its nighttime self. Enormous, patient, indifferent to everything except the slow turning of seasons and the steady work of the people who had decided to stay. The stars came out the way they always do in that country, in great unencumbered quantities, the sky so dark and the air so clear that the light of them was almost physical. Hazel Sheridan, who had pressed her back against a wall at a social and been surprised by the direction life had decided to travel, sat in her kitchen with her husband and listened to the prairie evening, and was grateful in the deep, quiet, daily way of someone who knows exactly what they have. The music had not yet started when he crossed the room to her. Everything that mattered had started then. And it kept starting every morning for all the mornings that came after, in the way of things that are real. Not once and done, but again and again and again, each time as true as the first.